In 1923, a farmer in the Kentucky mountains spent 6 months hiding from revenue agents. He lived in the woods with his wife and 4 children. No store, no market. They did not miss a single meal. Number 18 on this list must be boiled 3 times or it will kill you. Number 9 got children sent home from school because of the smell. Number 3 was eaten every Sunday across the Appalachian Ridge, and no restaurant has ever put it on a menu. These 25 meals were not recipes. They were survival spoken by people the law was hunting. Hit that subscribe button. From the hollers of eastern Kentucky to the ridgelines of western North Carolina, Moonshiners fed their families on things food historians never photographed and television never showed you. They were not outlaws who forgot to eat. They were farmers and foragers who knew every edible thing the mountain offered. This is what they actually ate. Number 25, cornmeal mush with sorghum. Before the sun came up in a Kentucky holler, before anyone moved toward the still or the woodpile, there was cornmeal. You stirred it slow into salted boiling water until it thickened into something that held its shape in the bowl. Then you poured sorghum molasses over the top. Not maple syrup, not cane sugar. Sorghum pressed from stalks grown on the mountain itself, dark and thick and faintly bitter at the edges. It cost nothing because they made it themselves. Every autumn from cane they grew in the bottom field. It was not breakfast. It was fuel. Number 24, leather breeches. Every August, when the green beans came in faster than a family could eat them, mountain women threaded them whole onto string and hung them from the porch rafters to dry. They called them leather breeches. The pods darkened over weeks, twisting and toughening in the mountain air. When winter came and the garden was frozen solid and the root cellar was running thin, you pulled the strings down and simmered the dried pods for hours in a pot of water with a piece of salt pork until they softened back into something you could eat. They tasted of summer and patience. The pods hanging from the rafters meant winter would not win. Number 23, poke salad. Every spring in the Appalachian Mountains, pokeweed pushed up through the mud before almost anything else grew. And every spring, families picked it and ate it. Pokeweed carries phytolactotoxin, a poison concentrated in the roots and in any leaf that has grown past its youngest stage. You picked only the smallest spring shoots, boiled them in a pot of water and drained it entirely, then covered them again with fresh water and boiled them a second time and drained again. 2 separate boilings, then you fried the greens in bacon fat with a little onion until they went dark and soft. Miss a step and the meal became something else entirely. Every spring, Moonshiners ate something that could kill a man who did not know how to cook it right. Number 22, ramp and fatback fry. In early April, before the trees leafed out, wild ramps pushed up from the creek bottoms and shaded hollows of the Appalachian ridges. Allium tricoccum, the broadleaf wild leek, a cousin of the onion, twice as sharp and twice as pungent. You sliced the fatback thin, rendered it in the cast iron pan until the fat ran clear, then threw in the ramps whole and let them go limp and dark in the hot drippings. The smell filled every room in the house and settled into every piece of clothing. School principals in West Virginia used to send children home for smelling like this. Number 21, red-eye gravy on corn pone. After frying a piece of salt-cured country ham in the cast iron pan, you poured black coffee directly into the hot drippings left behind and let it come to a simmer, scraping the bottom of the pan with a spoon. The coffee and the pork fat came together, the fat rising in a thin reddish ring at the surface, the red eye that gave the gravy its name. You poured it over a corn pone baked flat on the stovetop, the dense unleavened bread soaking up that dark, salt-bitter liquid until nothing was left in the pan. It was the only hot meal they allowed themselves to slow down for. Number 20, cracklin' bread. When the hog was butchered in November, the fat went into the largest pot to render over an open fire. After the lard was poured off and stored in crocks for the year ahead, what remained at the bottom of the pot were cracklins, small, golden, hard pieces of pork skin and cooked out fat. You folded them into cornbread batter and baked the whole thing in the cast iron skillet on the wood stove. The bread came out dense and salty, with hard pockets of crunch in every bite. The cracklins were the only part of the pig that never made it to anyone else's table. Number 19, squirrel and dumplings. The gray squirrel was the most reliable meat source in the oak-covered ridges of Appalachia. A man with a rifle in an hour could feed his family. You skinned the squirrel, cut it into pieces, and drop them into a pot of water with an onion and whatever root vegetables the garden still held, letting everything simmer low until the meat pulled loose from the small bone. Then you dropped in the dumplings' flour, water, a pinch of salt, pressed flat and torn into rough pieces and laid across the surface of the broth. The broth thickened as they cooked, and the whole pot became one thing. A man who could not hunt squirrel did not last long in the mountain. Number 18, pawpaw pudding. In September and October, the pawpaw trees that grew in the creek bottoms and hollow floors of the Appalachian Mountains dropped their fruit. Asamina triloba, the largest edible fruit native to North America and almost entirely unknown outside the region where it grows. You did not cook it. You split the green skin with your thumb and scooped the yellow flesh out with a spoon. It was sweet and soft, somewhere between a banana and a mango, with a tropical richness that made no sense this far inland. Moonshiner families who knew where the pawpaw patches sat guarded that location as carefully as the location of the still. It tasted like something a tropical country would brag about. Nobody ever bragged about it. Number 17, hominy with lard. Long before moonshiners ran their stills in these mountains, the Cherokee and other Appalachian peoples had discovered that dried corn soaked in wood ash lye lost its hull and became something nutritionally transformed, bigger, softer, and capable of releasing niacin that the body could not otherwise extract from plain corn. The process is called nixtamalization. Mountain families had absorbed this knowledge from the people who were on this land before them. You simmered the hominy low and long, stirred in a spoonful of lard, ate it salted from a bowl. The moonshiners learned it from people whose grandmothers had taught it for 1,000 years. Number 16, soup, beans, and cornbread. The pinto bean pot sat on the back of the wood stove from early morning. Salt pork, water, thyme. You did not tend it. By evening, the broth had darkened and the beans had gone soft enough to press flat between two fingers. You baked cornbread in the cast iron skillet alongside no sugar, just cornmeal and buttermilk and a flat of heat. You crumbled the bread into the broth and ate from the bowl at the kitchen table. And after the meal, you added water to what remained in the pot and set it back on the stove. The pot never fully emptied. They just kept adding water. Number 15, groundhog stew. The woodchuck was plentiful in the fields and wood edges of Appalachia, and it was eaten. Before cooking, you soaked the dressed carcass overnight in salted water to pull out the gamey, wild smell, then changed the water and soaked it a second time through the morning. Then you browned the pieces in the pan, dropped them into a deep pot with potatoes and wild onions and whatever root vegetables were still in the cellar, and stewed everything low all afternoon until the kitchen filled with the smell of something rich and thick. The meat came out dark. It fed the family for 3 days. Nobody asked what it was. Number 14, morel mushroom and cornmeal porridge. In April, for 2 or 3 weeks only, morel mushrooms appeared on the forest floor beneath dying elm trees and old apple orchards on the Appalachian hillside. The morchella, hollow-stemmed, honeycomb-capped, impossible to mistake once you had found one. Moonshiner families who knew their morel spots guarded that knowledge the same way they guarded the location of the still. You sautéed the mushrooms in a little fat until they gave up their moisture and went golden at the edges, then stirred them into a thin cornmeal porridge over the fire. The mushroom spots were passed down like property. Some families never wrote them down. The television version of the Appalachian moonshiner omits all of this. Hollywood spent decades constructing a romanticized figure, the rebel in the hills, the copper still hidden under a waterfall, the backwoods folk hero leading revenue agents on a chase through the ridges. That narrative sold movie tickets, television series, and bourbon labels with hand-drawn mountain men etched into the glass. What that narrative required, in order to function, was the removal of everything ordinary. The woman at the wood stove at 4 a.m, working through what to feed 6 people when the salt pork jar was empty and 3 months of winter remained. The moonshiner was not a character in an adventure. He was a farmer converting the one crop he could grow on steep, difficult mountain land into something worth carrying down to sell. The cooking that happened in those hollows was the architecture of daily survival. It was carefully omitted from every story ever told about these people. Number 13, chow chow relish on salt pork. At the end of summer, when the garden produced more than a family could eat fresh, green tomatoes not yet ripe, the last heads of cabbage, small, hard green peppers, mountain women made chow chow. Everything chopped and cooked down with vinegar, mustard seed, and a little sugar into a sharp, tangy relish that went into jars and sat in the cellar. Through January and February, you spooned it over salt pork or stirred it into the bean bowl, and it cut through the fat and the sameness of the winter diet with something bright and acidic. Nothing rotted. Everything became something else. Number 12, persimmon pudding. The wild American persimmon was inedible before the first killing frost. The tannins in an unripe fruit would pucker your mouth so severely it was almost a punishment. After the first hard freeze of November, those same tannins broke down, and the small orange fruits became intensely sweet, almost jammy at the center. Mountain people knew to wait. You mashed the ripe pulp through a sieve to remove the seeds and the skin, mixed it with cornmeal and a little fat, and baked it low in the cast iron until it set firm. The mountain taught patience. The persimmon only gave itself to those who could wait. Number 11, sassafras root soup. Sassafras trees grew along fence lines and wood edges throughout the Appalachian Mountains, and mountain families dug their roots in early spring and fall. You boiled the roots in water until the liquid turned a deep reddish orange with a flavor somewhere between root beer and anise, and something older than either. They drank it as tea and ate it as a thin soup, sometimes thickened with a little cornmeal to hold it together. Healers in the mountains prescribed it for rheumatism and for what they called cleaning the blood in spring. In these hollows, medicine and food existed in the same pot. Number 10, opossum with sweet potatoes. The Virginia opossum was hunted and eaten across the American South and throughout Appalachia, but the families who raised their own were in a different category. You caught a young opossum, penned it for a week, fed it on corn and sweet potato to clear the wild taste from the meat, then butchered it. You baked it low and long in the oven with sweet potatoes arranged around it, the fat rendering slowly into the sweet potato flesh. It was considered a meal worth setting at the table when company came. Families who raised their own opossum were considered well off. Number 9, souse meat. In November, when the hog was butchered, the head went into the largest pot on the stove. Ears, snout, cheeks, tongue, all of it. You simmered the head for hours, low and slow, until the meat came loose from the skull and the broth turned thick with natural gelatin. Then you pulled the meat by hand, chopped it roughly, and packed it into a pan with the dark broth, a pour of vinegar, black pepper, and sage, and set the pan in the November cold overnight. By morning, it had firmed to something that sliced clean. They ate the parts nobody else claimed. That is why they survived. Number 8, killed lettuce with bacon drippings. When the first tender lettuce pushed up from the kitchen garden in May, you did not dress it with vinegar and oil. You pulled the pale green leaves into a wide bowl, then took the cast iron pan off the morning fire, still holding the hot rendered fat from the bacon, and poured the drippings directly over the cold greens. The fat hit the lettuce and the leaves collapsed and wilted, hissing where the heat drove through them. You added a splash of vinegar and a pinch of salt and ate it immediately, while the greens were still warm. Hot fat poured over cold greens. The sound it made was the sound of winter ending. Number 7, Appalachian stack cake. The stack cake was not baked by one person. It was assembled by a community. When a wedding was coming in the mountains, each invited family baked a single thin layer of spiced gingerbread, dry enough to carry without breaking, and brought it to the celebration. There, the layers were stacked one by one with apple butter spread between each one, the dried mountain apples cooked down with spices into a thick, dark paste. The cake was not finished until every family had laid down their layer. You counted them when you arrived. The more layers, the more people who had loved this household enough to come. A bride with 12 layers was a bride whose family was loved. Number 6, corn liquor-soaked dried fruit. At the end of summer, whatever stone fruit could not be eaten fresh, peaches from the hillside trees, small wild plums, service berries was dried on wooden racks in the sun and packed into glass jars. Over the dried fruit, you poured corn liquor. The alcohol drew moisture back into the fruit slowly over months, and the sugars in the fruit fermented slightly. And what came out of the jar in winter was richer and stranger and deeper than either ingredient had been alone. Nobody touched the jar from August to December. Then December came, and the jar came down, And there was something sweet and sharp in the middle of the darkest month of the year. The wellness industry now markets these same practices for $60 a month in subscription boxes. The lacto-fermented vegetables from the chow chow jar, the collagen-rich broth from the souse pot, the whole animal protein from nose-to-tail hog butchering, wild greens picked from unsprayed mountain soil at the exact moment of peak nutrition, slow-cooked beans with their full nutritional profile built through hours of low heat, dried fruit preserved without additives and alcohol the family made themselves. Nutritionists now have names for all of it: ancestral eating, functional fermentation, whole food nutrition. The women in these hollows did not have a name for any of it. They could not afford to waste anything, and in not wasting anything, they arrived at a way of eating that modern nutritional science is still working to fully explain. They were not eating poorly. They never were. Number 5, squirrel brain and scrambled eggs. In eastern Kentucky, through most of the 20th century, Sunday morning in certain mountain households meant cracking open the skull of a freshly hunted gray squirrel and scrambling the brain with eggs in the cast iron pan. You fried it in a little butter, seasoned it with salt, and ate it with biscuits or cornbread at the kitchen table before church. It was small and rich, almost custard-like in texture, with a delicate flavor nothing like what the description would lead you to expect. Children who grew up on it did not know it was strange. It was just Sunday morning. Number 4, wild cress soup. In March, before the garden was planted and before the ramps had fully come in, watercress appeared in the cold, shallow streams that ran down off the Appalachian ridges. You waded into the creek, pulled the dark green stems from the running water with both hands, and brought them back to the kitchen, still cold and dripping. You simmered them with salted water, sometimes just water, nothing else until the greens went soft and the broth turned faintly green and clean tasting. After months of salt meat and dried beans and root vegetables, the first bowl of wild cress soup tasted like spring arriving 2 weeks early. Like being allowed to breathe again. Number 3, molasses and cornbread porridge. There were nights in the deep of winter when the cupboard held almost nothing. On those nights, you took leftover cornbread from the day before stale, hard at the edges, and crumbled it into a bowl. You poured boiling water over it and stirred in a pour of sorghum molasses until the bread broke apart and absorbed everything into a soft, dark mush. You ate it hot, sometimes standing at the stove, not bothering to sit down. It took 3 minutes. It filled you. This was not a recipe. This was what you made when making nothing was not an option. Number 2, the cornbread pot liquor. When the bean bowl was empty, the broth left in the pot dark, salted, thickened slightly from hours of cooking was not poured out. You tore a piece of cornbread and dragged it through what remained. Or you lifted the pot itself and drank from the edge. Children were told to scrape the pot clean before it was washed. Nothing went down the drain. The liquid that the beans had cooked in for 8 hours held everything the beans had given to it. The minerals, the starch, the deep, earthy salt of the pork. They drank the water that the beans had cooked in, and they did not waste a drop. Number 1, the nothing soup. When the garden was done, and the cellar was empty, and the salt pork was gone, and there was no money left to replace any of it, a Moonshiners family in the mountains of Appalachia did this. They took the dried corn cobs, left after the kernels had been stripped, the cobs and the outer husks, the parts most people had already fed to the animals, or burned for kindling, and boiled them in a large pot of water for an hour. The broth that came off was faintly sweet and pale gold, the last ghost of the corn itself, the memory of the harvest left behind in what nobody else wanted. You salted it. You crumbled in what was left of yesterday's cornbread. That was the meal. No meat, no vegetables, no fat, just corn water and old bread, and the decision to call it supper and sit down and eat it together. It was not a recipe anybody wrote down. It was what happened after every other recipe had already run out. These meals were never about poverty as a condition to be pitied. The people who cooked them were not defined by what they lacked. They were defined by what they built from what remained. They ran a still in the dark, kept a garden on a mountain slope that barely had enough flat ground to plant a row, preserved everything the season gave them, and when the season gave them nothing, they found the meal inside the thing most people had already thrown away. They did not stop. They adapted. Every single time. Pick one of these meals this week. Make the soup beans. Sit down at a table, not a couch. Eat slowly. Then tell us in the comments, what did your grandmother call survival? What did your kind of family make when there was almost nothing left in the house? This knowledge belongs to all of us. The only way it survives is if we keep talking about it.